Welcome, everyone, to the 12th Annual Life Sciences and Society Program Symposium. This is, as many of you know, probably the 5th or 6th event we're running so far this year, but the start of the kind of climax of the symposium over the next few days. We're going to be having a talk today, a talk tomorrow, and then 4 talks all day on Sunday. On Saturday. I'm glad. I haven't even had anyone. Okay. So when we were thinking last year what topic we would do this year, because as many of you know, we change topics every year for the symposium, many people brought up how timely the topic of climate change was, especially with the Paris Summit coming last fall, with the general election going on right now here in the US, and a bunch of other things kind of coming together. So we decided to focus on climate change. But rather than focus on is climate change happening, or what's the evidence for climate change? Of course, those things get covered here. We decided instead to focus on issues that I think are covered less, but are probably equally interesting and compelling. Those being, what are the consequences going to be of climate change for all of us, to things like health, agriculture, society? But then also, what should we be doing about climate change? What are the options, and what are maybe the best decisions that we could make? So that's kind of where we started focusing. But as you know, this is an interdisciplinary symposium. We've always focused on trying to draw on from many different disciplines and many different ways of looking at a topic. So this year, to kick off the talk tonight, and also 2 of the other talks over the course of the weekend, we decided we would bring in someone who has been trying to put together music and the question of climate change. So I'm going to introduce to you Daniel Crawford, and he is going to tell you a little about his work, and then he's going to play for you.
Thank you. As Dr. Schenk mentioned, my name is Dan Crawford. I recently graduated from the University of Minnesota, where I had the chance to study tree rings and how they relate to climate change. But I've been playing the cello since I was 9 years old, so that's always been a large part of my life. And while I was working in the tree ring lab at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Scott St. George approached me with the rather odd task of turning climate data into climate music. So what we chose to do was to take the entire global temperature record available from the Goddard Institute of Space Studies over at NASA, and what I did was I assigned each year 1 note on my cello, going back all the way to 1880 through the present. So each note that I'm going to play represents 1 year in chronological order, and the pitch of each note represents the global temperature for that year. So these lower pitches represent cooler years, and as you may imagine, higher pitches represent warmer years as we get towards the present. And the reason for doing this is because we know that the Earth is warming, but some people don't get the message that the Earth is warming by the typical tools that climate scientists use, which are maps, which are graphs, and occasionally when we can't find a visualization, we'll just put out numbers. So we chose to do this to communicate the data behind climate change in a different way, in a way that's not visual, but in a way that's auditory and relies on music, and might spur a little bit of emotion and cause people to think more deeply about what these data are representing. So with that in mind, I'm happy to perform a song of our warming planet.
As another piece, the MU Graduate String Quartet is going to be helping him perform the next piece, which has people at the pole and at the equator and spaced in between, showing what happens to the temperature. So if you want to hear that, come back for tomorrow's talk, 4 p.m. in this theater. We have Marcia McNutt talking about climate change, promise or peril at that time. So without too much further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Mike McKean from the MU School of Journalism. He's also the facilitator for Mizzou Advantage, one of our big funders for this event, for the Media of the Future initiative.
Thanks, Mary. That was cool, wasn't it? That was really, really cool. I just want to say a little bit. Mizzou Advantage, as you mentioned, is a big sponsor of this program. We have been for the past few years because we think it's important that we talk about interdisciplinary collaborations, especially around telling the stories of science. And in fact, we may be having an announcement here in the next couple of weeks about a new science communications center on campus. And so watch out for the announcement about that. Even in tough budget times, there are important things we need to do, and I think we'll probably have something good to say about that very soon involving Bond and the J School and some other folks on campus. Speaking of the Life Sciences Center, I again would just like to congratulate Jack and the whole team for putting together yet another fantastic symposium this year. Obviously, we think that climate science is an important topic, and I can think of no one who's better qualified to talk about how we address the perils of climate science and how we adapt to it than our speaker. If you haven't read about Andy Revkin, I'd be really surprised, but he is one of our most influential science journalists and educators. Just one example of his influence you probably saw in the program. It was almost 25 years ago that he was talking about naming an actual geological era after humans because of the impact we have on climate, something that we're talking about quite a bit more these days. Well, today Andy is an educator. He teaches applied environmental studies at Pace University. But probably most of you know him as the editor of the .Earth blog, which he launched several years ago on the editorial pages of the New York Times and news pages, and now it's a part of the opinions section. Just yesterday, to talk about one of the opinions that he shares, you'll see a slide here in just a minute when he gets up from his blog post yesterday, where he's quoting from somebody we all know pretty well, Peter Raven from the Missouri Botanical Gardens, talking about his lament, and I'm sure Andy's lament as well, that our presidential candidates are not talking about, and even the moderators, the journalists, are not asking them to talk about one of the biggest problems we face. Quote, "The world is continuously becoming less resilient, less beautiful, less rich, and less sustainable." Well, let's hear more of Andy's thoughts on that and other topics. Please join me in welcoming Andy Revkin.
There we go. Can you hear me? It's blinking green. Yeah, and I recorded that. I'll probably blog on Doug. It's Doug Crawford, right? Doug or Dan? Daniel, right. I already wrote about him, but seeing him in person makes it even more special. So let's get this. Oh, it looks like everything went to sleep. Come on, wake up. Okay, there we go. Yeah, this was yesterday's piece. I've been writing .Earth now. It's more than 8 years. I can't believe it. I started it when I was a news reporter to fill in the gaps between stories. And because climate change and the other issues I write about all the time, climate only being one, are very complicated. They're implicitly multidisciplinary, and they're very hard to fit into the standard template we use for news. So let me get right into my talk, though, because I don't want to waste any time. Yeah, so basically, I'm going to take you on my learning curve through 30-plus years of thinking about and writing about issues, climate change being the centerpiece because it's so consequential and it will have this impact on the planet for millenniums to come, with or without whatever we do now, because there's so much that's already happened. I'm going to focus on this idea of the Anthropocene because it's kind of the broader question within which the climate question sits. And as you can see from these photos, I've been at this for a long time, since I had kind of long, I guess that was 90s hair on the left there, writing about the future of New York City's water supply, to the Vatican. That's my, Where's Waldo picture in the middle there. You see me with the Pope. I was at the Vatican in 2014 for a week-long meeting. You'll hear more about it in a minute. And interestingly enough, much of the most consequential reporting I've done about the climate challenge has nothing to do with climate science. It has to do with other sciences and with my visit to the Vatican. You'll hear about that in a minute. There's a warning label on all my talks about these issues now. It comes from Murray Gell-Mann, Nobel Prize winning physicist who's now at the Santa Fe Institute. And I heard him give a talk a few years ago where he talks about the value, he studies complex systems of all kinds. And he talks about the merits of taking a crude look at the whole when you're looking at a very complex question, whether it's a national security issue or the future, what's going to happen with Iran with nuclear weapons, or whether it's how do we deal with climate change when it's fundamentally prismatic. It's fundamentally, if you tweak one button, something over there happens that you hadn't thought about. So that's where, and journalism, at least my journalism for 30 years in looking at this issue has had that property. I'm not a PhD, I don't have a PhD. I know a lot of PhDs, and I know who to call or who to ask, and I'm one of these rare people. Most scientists who are dealing with climate change, they're either a modeler, or they're on the sea ice at the North Pole doing direct observation, or they're a policy wonk, or they're in a lab like Nate Lewis trying to invent a better form of solar panel. But there are very few people who have had the gift that I've had of being able to kind of flit around and look at every single aspect of this question. So that's the crude look, though, and it's what I've tried to do is present it that way. I try to make sure people don't understand. As Brad Allenby at Arizona State, who's also kind of a complexity guy, says, don't drink my Kool-Aid. Think about my Kool-Aid, and think about everyone's Kool-Aid, and then find your own path. So we'll start by going back to 1956, the year and date of my birth. There's a really nice tool at populationaction.org. Those with devices, if you have permission to go to do this, go there, put in your birth date, and you can find your place on the curve of us. And as you can see, the curve of us, if you take this back to the left, it's just a little dribbly line. In 1800, there were only 1 billion people of all kinds, old, young, in between. Of course, old back then was 40. So 1 billion people then, there are 1 billion teenagers right now. Just wrap your brain around that one nugget, 1 billion teenagers, and there are 1 billion more younger kids. And that's how we know, that's how it's very clear that we're heading toward 9 billion or more, because 1 billion teenagers are going to procreate. It's almost inevitable. Of course, that's not the only thing. It's, as anyone who's studied the sustainability conundrum knows that it's not just the how many people. I wrote a few years ago, I said, suppose there were 9 billion vegan monks, have a very different kind of impact on the planet than 9 billion sort of Las Vegas gamblers. So it's how much stuff, too. How many people, how much stuff. Those two things make a big difference. And then the impacts of the consequences for the environment on us relate to how wealthy we are, how poor you are. That's a big determinator of how vulnerable you are. So this is not, just to show you, this is not just about, that curve of us is reflected in so many different parameters. The Great Acceleration is this project mainly based in Stockholm and elsewhere, where they've assembled all these data sets that have this, there's a pattern here, right? As we grow in number and as we grow in our economies, we use more and more and more stuff. There's something, there's change coming. Even without catastrophe, there's already signs. Lee Shipper, who passed away a few years ago, he headed a group at Berkeley and Stanford where they've already measured peak travel. It's not like if you get richer and richer and richer, you don't just travel more and more and more. Things do level off. Your use of resources, you don't always eat more meat. I mean, many of us eat too much meat, but including me. But it's not, there's change. It's not going to be like this. Now, the big question for us is like, do we wait till nature enforces that feedback to make us slow down, or do we just keep doing this? This is a picture one of my friends at the Times took, I think it was around 2009, at Black Friday, our great celebration of consumption, which, as you all know, has now migrated into Thursday, Thanksgiving itself. We can't wait, till Friday to enjoy Black Friday. And just think about like 9 billion people doing that, and you start to get the idea. On a middle classifying planet heading toward 9 billion or more people, how does that work out? That's the question I grapple with in some way or other every single day. You look at London from the space station. I hope you are all following Scott Kelly's wonderful daily year in space feed on Instagram and Twitter. This was not one of his pictures, but I think he helped provide a new sort of daily diet of what we're talking about, what this is all about. That we don't really think about as we're sitting here in our chairs or standing at this podium. You're not thinking you're on a planet. you are. You know, you're in space and all that stuff, and it's good to sort of be reminded of that. But the thing about London that's interesting is it's a mix of order and chaos. It's a mix of planning and structure and function and randomness. As you can see there, aspects of it are organic. We're following natural curves, riverbeds, and historically, you know, it grew out of, there's path dependency there. You can't suddenly invent a perfect London. So all of our infrastructure has this complexity and a mix of things. I'm going to talk about mixes of things a lot. So this is, as I said a minute ago, you know, basically the question is, can we do better than bacteria? Yeah, bacteria will grow infinitely on agar as long as there's not waste materials or whatever in the way. And on another arena, I've asked the same question: can we be smarter than dinosaurs? You know, we're facing known geohazards, including from space, the next asteroid. And there are many scientists I'll talk to who say we're very inadequately, it wouldn't take a big adjustment in our investment in getting the capacity to do the Armageddon thing without Bruce Willis going to an asteroid. If we don't take that seriously, we might have big regrets. We'd all be fighting about global warming and something else happens, and you think, well, why weren't we thinking about that? So can we do better than bacteria? Can we do better than dinosaurs? I hope so. Science, you know, basically since the middle of the last century, this thing called sustainability science in all its colors has been saying, hey, H. sapiens, there's an edge to the Petri dish. That's basically what science is saying. There's an edge to our Petri dish. Planetary boundaries is the latest terminology. There's many different iterations of that going back through the decades. Here's the deal, though. You know, scientists handing this information down. This was 2007 at the Paris rollout of the third IPCC, the third Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. Martin Parry is kind of pointing at these different risk factors, water, health, coasts. But when I look at this, it's a very retro way to think about how you would tell people to change their ways. It reminds me a little bit of Moses coming down from the mountain. It's got, you know, the IPCC report is more about data than about feelings and handed down from the mount. But there's and that didn't work out too well for Moses, at least initially. And it also reminds me of this scene from Rebel Without a Cause.
It's not a place for kids.
A minute ago, you said you didn't care if he drinks.
He said a little drink.
You're tearing me apart!
So Jim Backus is like the IPCC, the father, you know, and we are the pubescent, you know, James Dean driving too fast, and, you know, we've all been through puberty. Let's see, is there anyone younger than teenage? No, I guess so. So we all know that feeling of being, that feeling is not a good feeling most of the time. It's like you develop almost instinctively a resistance to that kind of messaging. So it's hard, you know, can we, what do we want to be when we grow up is one way I characterized the human challenge in 2008 on a piece called Puberty on the Scale of a Planet. And I think it's still a way to look at this. And, you know, in the meantime, as we're kind of figuring this out, the world is full of losses. As Peter Raven said in that column, you know, whether it's the loss of what's happening in Africa with our appetite for ivory and other ridiculous things, it feels like it's a now thing, but when you look back, of course, here in North America, you know, we talk about the killing of the lion there, Cecil, not, what was the name of the lion? Cecil, you know, where are all our lions, our mountain lions? In the Northeast, we had a miraculous mountain lion showed up and got killed by a car on the Merritt Parkway near Greenwich, Connecticut. They come from the Dakotas, and it was tracked through its hair samples that it was leaving on rubs all across northern United States. And that animal, it was a miracle that it got to Connecticut, and it's because they used to be there a lot. And this was, just to give you a sense, you know, here, west of here in the Great Plains, in the 1800s, we extirpated so many things. We almost extinguished the bison, came really close. This is a pile of bison skulls. There were so many bison carcasses all across the plains, and in the late 1800s, it turned out someone said, hey, you know, if you treat this like charcoal, if you sort of char it, you get a really good pigment. It's called carbon black. So this trainloads of skulls were shipped east to be turned into pigment, black pigment. And so we had our Armageddon like that too. It's important for us to remember that this habit of ours is not a new thing. And then, it's really easy to get bummed out when you look at, as you heard the curve, that was the temperature curve. This is the CO2 curve of us, from 1750. His music was from about here to now, and it was temperature. Temperature is much more variable, as we know, than CO2. CO2 is building up in the atmosphere because it's long-lived and it doesn't go away quickly, so it's like not paying your credit card debt. It doesn't go away. Even spending less doesn't make your credit card debt go down, right? It keeps going up. So that's where we're at, and that's a reflection of, remember those other curves of us? So we need to break, how do we break that pattern? It's happening slowly. In China, well, actually globally, today, it was just today or yesterday, there was a new analysis showing that we are decoupling. Our progress, our economic activity is decoupling from CO2. That's happened a long time ago in the United States and Europe. We've been decoupling our CO2. It's not like you have to burn more coal to get every extra dollar of production and of quality of life. And so, but it has to go from slowing to this, and we'll talk about that a little later. This can all leave you, like it has left me, feeling like this. I took this picture on the last day of the Copenhagen climate talks in 2009, which was kind of the nadir, the lowest point in several decades of climate diplomacy, when things felt like they were falling apart. And there was all this pressure for a binding treaty with targets and timetables. Like, we did it with ozone, why can't we do it with this stuff? And everybody focused on this question has felt like this photographer, for different reasons. He was literally physically exhausted, like we all were. But we've all had that feeling of, what do we do? What do we do? What's going on? And that's why it's not surprising that after I wrote about finding a good way to approach the Anthropocene, seeing if there's a good outcome possible, that Clive Hamilton, an ethicist in Australia, who's kind of a curmudgeon, which is fine, and a prickly man, which is fine. Every time I've met him, he's fun. But he wrote a piece really attacking this idea that you could have anything you could possibly call a good Anthropocene. And my friend Betsy Colbert tweeted this. I love this tweet. 2 words that probably should not be used in sequence: good and Anthropocene. Very smart essay by Clive Hamilton. After his piece ran, I did a piece on .earth where a blogger at Grist got us together via Skype, and we did a long, fruitful conversation that got behind these caricatured good, bad. I guarantee you that Betsy Colbert and Clive Hamilton are not pursuing a bad Anthropocene, right? We don't want that, so what do you do in the meantime? And I'm not talking about a fabulous Anthropocene. This was a great art installation done by Robin Woolston in England. I didn't go there, but I found out about it and posted some of the pictures. This is sort of a take on that. There's a sign in Las Vegas. It's a famous icon like this, and she made this wonderful piece of art, which gets at that. One of the great hidden messages here, at least for me, is when you think back to the idea of the good life, you have like the Vegas kind of good life, the good, like Frank Sinatra would sing about, and you have Plato, his good life. And how does that? They're very, very different. And so finding a goodness in us in the midst of complexity and fast change and a lot of emotion is a vital enterprise. So how do you do it? I've been trying to figure that out. So let's go back to me, my story. I'm going to fast forward through here just because I want to make sure we have time for questions and stuff. So back to 1956, and when I was a kid, one characteristic I have is that I'm a middle child. And I think it's reflected in how I approach inquiry. I talk to everybody, and I've wanted, the Times created years ago a feature on the website called Room for Debate, and I keep telling my colleagues we should create room for agreement. Because I always find something that people who will be divergent on many things will find agreement on, but it's so antithetical to our discourse these days to try to do that. But it is this, and I'll show you an example of how this has played out. I'm going to fast forward to, this was a debate after a showing of Pandora's Promise, which is a documentary that has a very much a pro-nuclear approach. Robert Stone and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's a very, very aggressively anti-nuclear activist and a friend of mine, I've known Bobby for years, and he teaches at Pace University too. So I was the moderator of this debate after showing the film, and this was a staged photo in the lobby, but that's kind of my role many times. And I'll just give you one quick example of how this plays out. When there was a lot of stories a few years ago, 2011 or so, grain commodity prices has spiked. And these are two guys, Lester Brown and Vaclav Smil, who both are very learned on global trends and resources. And they are completely divergent. And they will not even talk to each other. And when I told Vaclav that I was doing a piece assessing views of whether climate change was a part of this spike in food prices, and I was going to cite Lester, he literally, I could feel his head exploding, even though it was through an email. It was like, how could you talk to, he has a very fast-paced way. I could hear him yelling at me like, how could you talk to Lester? This is ridiculous. And so I got them, I became like it was like one of those shuttle diplomacy. Like I would email Lester Brown and said, here, come on, Vaclav. He just said this. And so I did this like intermediary thing. And even though they have these divergent views about what was going on then, I got them both agreed that in 2050, the dietary norms of a middle-class person will not be the ones we have now. That you can't have the meat consumption and the water and the energy consumption in our diets that we have now. So I got some agreement, and I threw that on the blog. So that's just to give you a sense that that's like how I try to work quite often. But that was kind of a fast forward. So 1968, here I'm like 12, 13 years old. And that's me holding the fish on the left and my brother on the right. And I was growing up in Rhode Island, liking the world, fish, and it felt like a very bucolic kind of happy existence, of course, when you think about what was going on in 1968. My little suburban paradise where I would walk down through the woods to this river behind the supermarket and catch fish and stuff was in the middle of all this. That was the year the population bomb came out. That was the year there were horrible assassinations. Vietnam and duck and cover exercises were still the norm. So that was a period when the environmental movement, like many things, had this very woe is me feel. And if it wasn't about that, it was about this, sort of a finger waggy feel. And I grew up with that. So my first sort of environmentalism moment came right around that time when I was walking through the woods behind our house to go to that little river I used to sit by. And I saw this this bulldozer. This is not the actual bulldozer. Back then, we didn't all have like an iPhone in our pocket. This is a picture I harvested on the internet. Public domain. But it reflects what I saw in the woods. There was like someone was building a house behind my house. And it was right next to a tree that I really loved. And I ran back into my house and I got some paper and a pen and I scribbled a death threat. I'm 12. I didn't really think through the seriousness of that. I threw it on the seat, he who demolishes these woods will face horrible retribution, blah, blah, blah. Sort of like a 12-year-old version of a death threat. And so that was my first environmentalism. It was very in tune with that, us versus them, finger-wagging stuff. I was not present enough to realize, it took me probably 20 or 30 years thinking back on this to realize that there had been a bulldozer just 10 years earlier clearing the suburban development where the house that we were living in sat. So, I wasn't thinking about that. And now, part of this is just age, You start to reflect more on broader consequences. So I went to college. I was not a journalist. I had no interest in journalism. Those were two of my literary heroes. I made these snow figures at Brown University after a big snowstorm. Blizzard of 77, I think it was. That Mark Twain and Shakespeare. And I started to fall in love with ideas. René Dubos, who wrote about the possibility of a humane, sort of a human landscape being a beautiful thing, which was kind of such a contrast to what I'd grown up with. It's all we're terrible. And Jacques Cousteau, he made me, my initial goal was to be a marine biologist. I grew up in Rhode Island. I liked to go in the water. I saw a scallop swimming one day, see the idea of a bivalve that could swim. Unbelievable. And then he was on TV just putting a camera underwater, saying like, ooh la la, and that's all he had to do. He didn't have a PhD. He's basically an engineer. And my first mask for my bar mitzvah, someone gave me a U.S. Divers snorkel kit, and that was his company, because he had invented the aqualung and with another guy. And so I was totally into that, and music. You'll hear more about music later. But I wasn't a journalist yet. My senior year, I applied for this fellowship that 3 people every year got to go somewhere in the world and do something goofy or interesting or whatever. And I got it. And my goal was to study man's relationship to the sea. And I was going to go to some islands and do that, which was really cool. So I went to this place, Raiatea, which is part of French Polynesia. It was a really easy sell to this committee of graybeards. You know, I'm going to go to Polynesia and study man's relationship to the sea. It worked. I lived with this family, 10 kids. And I went back in 1988. You should see the picture in 1988. And then I ended up joining the crew of a sailboat. Just total serendipity for the young people in the audience. If you have a chance to go somewhere weird, and if there's some fork in the road when you might get on a boat or go up a mountain or something, try to do it because it gets really harder as you go through life. So that was in New Zealand. I was there for a science conference. But I ended up on this boat called the Wanderlust. You know, and we went I took it 2/3 of the way around the world. We had unbelievable adventures. That picture on the right is the Maldives, which, remember, I'm not a journalist yet, but I'd been to the Maldives where you could feel the ground vibrating under you from the surf. The highest elevation there is about 8 feet above sea level, the islands we were at, and you get a sense of what that life is like on the edge of exposure to the ocean. And it was all kind of great. But then I started to see things, and this is what started to transition me to journalism. In Djibouti, which at that time basically was a French military base, and a bunch of very poor people selling odds and ends. Like, I remember a woman with like 3 tomatoes on a towel. That was what she was selling at the market. And I walked around a corner and I saw this pile of leopard skins by the tobacconist. And I thought, what the WTF? What is going on? Where, you start to think, where are these leopards coming from? How could they kill so many leopards? They aren't like predators, they have big ranges and stuff. So I took the pictures. I'd been taking photographs, and I thought, maybe I'm going to be a journalist when I get back to the real world when I grow up. And there were other adventures like that along the way. And then the other thing you learn when you're sailing around the world is that the world is round. Like, you end up heading back toward where you came from anyway. And you learn that nature is powerful. I was at the wheel when, in a storm in the middle of the night, when we ran aground in Greece, and getting off that sandbar was interesting. We got off, and that's me helping fix the bottom of the boat. At any rate, all that added up to the need to kind of grow up. It was like a Peter Pan kind of transition. And the thing that I started to pursue was journalism. So I started in magazines. Remember, the 1980s were big. Science journalism was a growing, thriving enterprise. I'll talk about this issue and this story in a minute. This is my first article about climate, humans and climate. It was 1985, cover of Science Digest magazine. This was 1983 when I literally just started. But just to show you how much things change, it's not just that it's digital now. This magazine doesn't exist anymore. But look at the first ad. This is a science magazine. The first ad is tobacco. Yeah. So that tells me that's actually good, right? Because it feels, wow, things actually do change. Liquor on the back. And I got really sucked into journalism. My first piece was on paraquat, an herbicide that was kind of like Roundup. It degrades quickly once you spray it. It was vital for no-till agriculture. It was a great agricultural tool. The problem is if you accidentally drank it or if it got into your respiratory system, it would kill you. And it was preferential. It loves to kill lung tissue. And there was a long story I told a journalism student earlier about how I came upon the story. And it ended up winning an award. But just to show you, like, things are like, it's all hard. I don't know. It was easier then. There was a lot of naivete. Just to show you how naive, see this picture? This was from the brochure of ICI, the British company that manufactured paraquat. And it's a picture of a guy spraying, a barefoot man somewhere in Southeast Asia, spraying paraquat on his legs. This is in the brochure. So I didn't have to uncover duplicity. It was just kind of like there. And again, things have gotten tougher. And back then, it just felt like a target-rich environment in some ways. So yeah, nuclear winter, 1985. This is the first story. It relates directly to what I've been writing about about global warming, because the same models that were already being used to assess the growing greenhouse effect were deployed in this case to test what would happen if we filled the atmosphere with smoke by burning so many cities in a nuclear conflagration that we blocked sunlight and chilled the planet. It became more like nuclear autumn shortly after, another year or two's worth of work. And that said something about how journalism and how science works. Science doesn't always crystallize things and make them starker. As more science digs in, it makes things more nuanced and complicated. Hurricanes are a classic example with global warming. When I wrote my first piece on global warming in 1988, these are both online. Just, if you want to find anything I read, just Google for my name and the thing, like Revkin paraquat, Revkin nuclear winter, Revkin climate. And you can read all, I've scanned them all, they're all online. But back then, the hurricanes in a warming world at that point was very simple. Warmer oceans, more energy, hurricanes stronger. Now it's more nuanced. Warmer world, fewer hurricanes, the ones that form look like they'll end up in stronger categories. But if you're a mayor of a coastal city, is that operational information? Not really. So we've known for a while that there's something that's going to go on that will change hurricanes. The precipitation in hurricanes will get heavier, for sure. 1992, the Museum of Natural History in New York staged a big exhibition. It was the first exhibition on global warming, and that's when I wrote my first. I'd written a book already on the Amazon and a murder there of Chico Mendes, but my second book was this one, and it's also online. You can actually buy it for like 99 cents on Amazon used. I don't get a penny. There's a section of the book where there was almost like a throwaway section. It was a section on the growing human impact, and at the end, I just was thinking about. I stepped back and thought, what's going on here? And I wrote this passage. Perhaps Earth scientists of the future will name this new post-Holocene era. The Holocene is this period since the last ice age. For its causative element, for us, we're entering an age that might someday be referred to as, say, the Anthropocene. It's Anthropocene, okay? That's the word that's come, but this was my rough, it basically felt easier, like easier on the tongue. I didn't know about Greek etymology and whatever. It's a geological age of our own making. The challenge now is to find a way to act that will make geologists of the future look upon this age as a remarkable time. And, this is that question, are we better than bacteria or not? And when I was writing this, I was thinking like 100 years from now, some scientists will convene and think about this. But it's just 8 years later that Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stormer said, hey, we're leaving the Holocene. And that now, since then, it's become much more of a rigorous question. They kindly invited me onto the Anthropocene working group. I'm the only non-scientist because of this. So if you look on Wikipedia, I'm like paragraph 8, maybe paragraph 10 is about this stuff. And it's just been very kind. In April this year in Oslo, where there's the third meeting of this Anthropocene working group, to come out with a final formal recommendation to the broader geological community that this is a new juncture, a new epoch, as some geologists say. And I'm mostly along for the ride. It's been fascinating, but I'll tell you one thing, it's going to take a long time for the geological community to make that decision. It reminds me of the tree ants in Lord of the Rings, where you got to go to war, bad things are happening, come to war, and the tree guardians are like, whoa, it takes a long time. Geologists are kind of like that. Don't count on a swift vote. So then I came to the New York Times in the mid-90s, and I learned a lot about newspaper journalism. Magazines you're so, make sure I'm not going to run out of time. Oh gosh, well, we started late. Can we end late? With a magazine piece, you have time to suck your thumb and double check your facts. There's a fact checker. What a nice thing that is. Some person who just checks the facts. Newspapers are not like that. One of my editors said, right after I had started, I was writing a really stupid little piece about a park agency meeting, and he's like leaning over my shoulder at 6:30 saying, Revkin, this ain't no seed catalog. And he's right, the presses will roll. So, and I learned about the limits and strengths of this medium. And I've done, I did all kinds of stories. I was at the failed treaty talks as the Supreme Court was figuring out what happened with Gore and Bush, I was in The Hague in the Netherlands with that. Could you imagine being the US negotiators there at the time when you didn't know who was going to be the next president in real time? Investigative pieces. I went to the North Pole. It's been an amazing ride. But this kind of journalism is an atavism. It's going away. And it had this very kind of comfortable feel.
This is my last broadcast as the anchor man of the CBS Evening News, and that's the way it is. Friday, March 6th, 1981.
You see, for the younger people in the audience, back then we didn't have to actually think. Just think about that. Someone said, that's the way it is. And it was the front page of the New York Times, CBS, some avuncular, mostly white men, and increasingly it was a woman or an African American, but they were all kind of avuncular and kind of giving you this. We all had this common comfort food dinner, like mac and cheese every night. And it was at dinner, it was literally at dinner. We'd be watching the news from Vietnam or whatever. And now it's like this, okay? If your issue is climate, I'm sure some of you check out websites. But you see, it's still comfort food, but in this media environment we have now, it's comfort food for everybody, no matter what you think. If you're arch skeptic, or if you're a true believer, or very worried, or if you just want to really know what's happening, you have a place to go. So it's like the world's biggest buffet. So we went from having this one meal to the ultimate buffet, and so this thing called the World Wide Web, which everyone, including me, thought would create what I called the noosphere, building on this word noosphere. It has much more potential to isolate us more than ever from each other. And that requires work. It requires intentionality on the part of the users of the system. If you want to get something productive done, you have to get out of your bubble and find relationships with people and also interact with the other. We'll talk about that in a minute too. And now, by the way, if you're into climate or whatever your issue, your sub-issue is, all of that is immersed in this. There's a website called newsmap.jp. It's basically a real-time picture of what's in the media around the world. This is you can specify for country. This is just U.S. This was not today. This was January 6th. But you can go there right now and see what we're all thinking or considering right now. And it's noisy. And what I did was just to show you that last slide is there, and that's actually too big. If you actually look at news coverage through the course of a year, not just climate, but environment is this tiny, tiny, tiny fragment of that bigger mass of economics and sports and whatever. And people say, oh, the United States, we're such an anomaly. The same day, Newsmap, this is the world. So this is the United States. This is the world. This was the big news on January 6th was Hashim Amla shocks the world, decides to relinquish Test captaincy after. So who here knows the sport? Yes, cricket. So it's not like just a U.S. thing. The world is full of stuff that's distracting and that takes us away from these long-term questions, whether it's about climate change or anything else. And it was this kind of reality that in 2007 prompted me to create .earth. When I was still a news reporter, no one told me to do it. It wasn't like the Times said, hey, news reporter, create a blog. It felt like, given the scope of this issue, that it's an energy problem and a behavioral problem and a political problem and a technical problem and a biological problem, I felt the blog was necessary as a way to sort of have that prismatic way of looking at it. And a blog is kind of at least for me, it's an interrogatory process. Sometimes on .earth I'm saying this happened today, but mostly I'm trying to reflect and draw together elements that together create more meaning than some particular fact might on its own. And so here's a piece on that question. To me, it's like, can we shift from a sprint to a marathon intentionally? Can we do that? I don't know. But that 2007 was also when things got really, really weird. As I'm sure you know, there was all this, that sort of 2005 through 7 through 9, ClimateGate capped that period. The intensity around this issue just grew ridiculous. Part of it was because legislation was building. So it was becoming not just some nicey-nicey thing, and the treaty process, which had been all aspirational and voluntary from 1992 till then, was starting to move toward having a treaty with targets and timetables. So the stakes were rising. And it moved from being an environment minister issue to a finance minister issue for many countries. And here in the United States, it moved, obviously it was going to undercut profit lines for big companies. And Al Gore's film came out in the middle of all this and generated a lot of vitriol and a lot of intensity. And that was part of that period. That period really made it a political emblem more than it had been until then. And that's when I started to look at a whole new body of science. So like 2007, let's see. So 1985 till 2005, my first 20 years of writing about this issue, I really wrote about it as like a biogeophysical problem. And then when this all happened, I started writing about the behavioral science for the first time. And it went, oh my God, now I understand. And it was really, well, you'll learn more in a second. So I think there should be a sequel to the film. I'm really bad at Photoshop, but I finally, so we had an inconvenient truth, now we should have an inconvenient mind. And I wrote about this notion a while ago. And here's one example of what I mean. These are Nobel Prize winners in physics, okay? So they know basic physics. And depending on your view, whatever your view is, whether you're a complete naysayer or a really alarmed, freaked out person, or in the middle, you can find a Nobel Prize winning physicist to take into a bar and help you in your debate. Like in that Woody Allen movie where he brought in Marshall McLuhan and said, you know nothing about my movies. Yeah, so you can, and this website is just one of the, Cultural Cognition is a body of work by a guy at Yale named Dan Kahane, who's done empirical studies showing that more intelligence, more science literacy are not indicators of your view on global warming. And so here I am, a science writer who spent 20 years trying and sometimes succeeding in winning awards for writing articles more clearly communicating climate science, and this work all says information mostly doesn't matter. And you put that together with the web, where you can go find your information, whatever it is, and I was like, oh, it was really existential threat to me in a way. And just to give you a sense, this is not like just climate change. I don't like the word deniers. We could have a whole hour on that. But people with different divergent views. One thing that I've learned, one of the big things I've learned in this whole arena is there's no we. There is no we. I've used the word we probably 15 times in the last 20 minutes. On this issue, there is no we. And look, so we need to solve the climate problem, okay? Bill McKibben, friend of mine for all these years, has his way. And George Monbiot in England, who's an equally passionate environmentalist and climate campaigner, their views are so divergent that when Fukushima happened 5 years ago, almost exactly, same day, they had columns in The Guardian. George said, this proves that we need nuclear power, and even though he said this was a terrible plant and was terribly positioned and terribly designed, and it did not melt down, therefore, this demonstrates that we need nuclear power more than ever if you care about climate change. And Bill, of course, wrote the column the same day saying, this proves that it's too brittle and we got to go small and renewable. And you see that and you realize that these divergences are not just ideological, at least in the sense, they have common ideology when it comes to the climate crisis and completely divergent views on what to do about it. We'll talk about that more in a couple minutes. Here's another there is no we reality. On the right, that's my sister's new little tiny kitchen in her apartment in Manhattan. And this is a kitchen in India. The picture came to me from Pachauri, Rajendra Pachauri long ago, who got into trouble later, but he ran an energy institute and the IPCC. And you probably know statistics on how many people die young, mostly women and kids, by breathing indoor air pollution from that kind of cooking. So there's no we when it comes to energy in a big way. We can talk about that more. So that then takes me to the reality that you look at the grand scheme of the planet, where you have countries with such different conditions, you have people with such different belief systems, even people who believe global warming is a serious problem, that it feels like the path forward is not as neat and clean as I had presumed it could be. Because I, like many people, approach this as a pollution problem. I grew up with pollution. The Clean Air Act was passed, and blah blah blah. We kind of sailed forward. But now it feels much more like human progress. Often looks like rugby, not cricket. I still don't understand cricket. And actually, I don't understand a scrum either. Someone here can explain that. But we kind of move in this dynamic, weird way. And you know, you could look at this and go, oh, WTF, just forget about it, we're doomed. Or you can start to look at it, well, what can you work with? What can we do? Can we work with that? Can we work with diversity? Can we figure out how to make progress on a variegated planet with variegated views and variegated needs? And I do think we can do that. And so I've recently started using a new word, so Anthropocene, you know, Anthropocene. Well, I think we need a little anthropophilia. I wrote a piece about this a few years ago, and I don't mean like, oh, aren't we great? Just like I don't mean fabulous Anthropocene. I mean, and by the way, if you look in, this is what anthropophilia already is a word, and it's about parasites that prefer human beings to other animals. But it wouldn't be the first word that develops a new meaning. I would like it to have a new meaning going forward. And I think it's possible. Maybe I'll end up being a Wikipedia entry here too someday. And by the way, it grows out of my friend Ed Wilson's biophilia. See, biophilia exists, but there's also biophobia. I saw a lot of that in the Amazon. I experienced it in the Amazon when things were attacking me. You know. Anthropophilia is also about, it's part of biophilia because we are living creatures, we're part of the system. So you know, to sustain progress on a finite planet that's increasingly under our sway, whether we want that to be the case or not, we need to figure ourselves out. And to do that, you need to look at yourself. You need to kind of examine your feelings, examine why we're different, examine how you work with that, work with the scrum instead of try to get us to all line up neatly. That's kind of, think about, well, I won't go into politics, but we don't always line up neatly, and it's probably not good when we do. So you can learn more about that by Googling for, and part of this is re-examining goals too. Our goals in this arena have largely been numbers, and numbers are important. You know, anyone you have to gauge what's going on. You have to measure consistently so that cello piece has meaning. If it was just random notes, there's meaning in that rising melody. So numbers matter, and even these kinds of interpretations of numbers, not everyone agrees on 350. The IPCC is mostly about rising risk with rising temperatures. It's gradients. 80 by 2050, show me someone who can tell me how we do that in the real world that we know, and I'll march with you. Less than 2 degrees, same kind of thing. We know trajectories are in the wrong direction. What do you do in that scrum to give better odds of moving things in another direction? And I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but Paris was like 2 weeks, 3 weeks of, well, you know, years of debate about, this looks wonky, but it's actually pretty simple. These numbers are what matter, 2020, 2030. And blue is safe. And yellow, well, the top one is the sort of the, you know, where we're heading now. The yellow one is current policy. And those two there were sort of the negotiations in Paris. Could we be better than 2 degrees, blah, blah, blah. So and then, of course, it became a triumph on a certain scale. We got to the lower threshold for these countries' pledges. But this was all about 2020 to 2030. Now think about the curve of us. Remember those zooms? And then zoom out here. So this is 2010 to 2090. This is the century, basically. This is the 21st century. Blue is safe. Paris is that. Does that feel like a triumph? Or what does it feel like? And this could lead you back to like the TV cameraman. Yes. It's important to understand this, though, because it is the reality. Whether or not you agree on that blue, so say you're like skeptical about the severity of blue, say it's like here. It's still, that's a huge challenge in a world heading toward 9 billion people who want to have decent lives, which means energy. Jesse Osabel at Rockefeller University said this to me once, and this is reflected in that graph that you just saw. Politicians are mostly pulling on disconnected levers when it comes to energy. That sometimes things change. You know, car mileage can be mandated, but a lot of what we see that looks dramatic and consequential is really reflecting what's possible. Now, this I am going to fast forward through. A guy did this wacky, interesting modeling. He's a brilliant European-based modeler who works for the EPA on sustainability. The only thing you need to get the idea, and this will all go online, his conclusion was, we can get through the next 200 years, we can have a smooth transition to some nice human outcome with coordinated manipulation of at least 6 variables. Think about the scrum, think about our election, think about India, and then think about coordinated manipulation of 6 variables on a planetary scale. I asked him after, he gave this talk at a meeting on climate and civilization that I was presenting at as well. And I said, so what, how do we do that? And it doesn't feel doable. And he said, I quoted him on .earth. He said, we lack a cultural narrative that says sustainability is really important. We have a cultural narrative that says murder is wrong. We don't have a cultural narrative that says managing our planet in a way that allows us to live on it as long as we can is probably the most important thing. It is the most important thing, right? Maybe, yes, seems like it. But, so cultural narrative. And then this is where I told you earlier, the most important reporting I think I've done for my own learning has not been science writing, reporting. It's been about this issue, these ethical questions. How do you adjust how we behave, knowing that we're not going to get things right? How do you do that? Least wrong. And that's what led me to the Vatican, and you'll see more on that in a minute. So new goals. So I talked about the weaknesses, the old goals. The new goals to me look more and more like you deal with traits. Like, what are the traits in a life or in a society that give you the best sense of the best comfort level that we're heading in a good direction? I think you could probably list 4 or 5 or 6 traits. Empathy, communication. The 1996 heat wave in Chicago, the study that showed that neighborhoods that had lower mortality rates were those where everyone knew where the old people were. This is, so communication, interactivity. So I started thinking about this, and it reminded me. I have 2 sons, one who's 25, one who's 18. It reminded me of looking at your kid when they were a baby. Like, you could think, well, I'd love him to be a dentist or whatever, or a hedge fund manager. Or you could say, well, what are the qualities I can kind of nurture in this kid that allow me to let go as a parent? That is the hardest thing the hardest challenge I've experienced as a parent is that, we all have the urge to control, like, remember the IPC, the climate treaty process or to work on traits and then let go. And I guess maybe it means I'm becoming libertarian or something. I don't know. I hope I have some good friends who are. But so that's the dynamic. How much of this is top down? How much of this is about nurturing and letting go? And it reminds me, my wife worked at this nature museum where the woman who runs it created a grasshopper grove. And Grasshopper Grove is a safe place to play freely. So it's a place where kids can be put and it's kind of safe in terms of nothing sharp, but it's sort of like a safe place. That gives you that feeling of being able to let go, and of course, experiencing nature is a good thing too. So that's where I'm at, and I started thinking about these traits about whenever that was, 2013. On Twitter. I laid it out. I said I just was outlining this idea literally in scattered thoughts. Strategy for sustainable human progress: bend, stretch, reach, teach, reveal, reflect, rejoice, repeat. I'll elaborate. And then I did 8 more tweets about each one about those words, and then I did a blog post with each one as an expansion on each word, and I'm overdue to try to write a book, expanding that out more. Now I'm going to go into fast forward because I want to get to have at least a little time to talk. And basically, you can come up with your own words. I'm not telling you use my words. And they all have meanings. Bend is resilience, which is kind of boring because we all know what it is. There's a resilient design even for a coastal city in a rising sea, an era of rising sea levels. It's not easy to build the politics to do that. It's easy actually to design it. It's not easy to. Mayor Bloomberg, I chided him a couple of years ago when he was leaving office. He gave this climate speech where it was a "we will not retreat" speech instead of a "we will go soft" speech. But if you're his press officer, I put this in front of young communication students sometimes. I say, okay, a new mayor comes into New York City who knows that sea levels will be rising basically through the next centuries to come. We don't know how fast. So write me a speech, the mayor says, that says, we will retreat. We will retreat smartly. Write me a politically tenable speech that says we will retreat. And just play that around in your head. It's hard. It's really hard. I don't even know how to do it. But someone has to figure that out. Bend is about your own personal bending. Billy Parrish is, to me, like a crystallization of this. There he is in bare feet in Montreal at the climate talks in Montreal in 2005. Energy Action was this organization he helped start. They did great work there, but he, realized there were limits. So he then went on to create co-create a company called Mosaic, Solar Mosaic, that produces a financing mechanism for installing solar panels on roofs of nonprofits and things like that, where an average person can put in a small amount of money to create a pot of capital to do that. I threw in $400 just to see how it works. And they pay you a standard return, like a 4.5% rate of return. Try that at your bank. And it's working, at least it's slow, it's hard. But to me, that kind of agility or flexibility is resilience too. The Paris Agreement. Perrin Ireland, a great artist, did this piece that I put on .earth about the Paris Agreement. But as I wrote here, this is the first time in more than 20 years of treaty making that they abandoned the idea of a top-down structure, and basically instead of having a journey to an outcome, the outcome is a journey. Paris created a 100-year journey that we're just getting started on. Very imperfect, soft, nudgy journey, but we'll see how it works. Stretch is innovation. It's science and engineering and creating a culture with the capacity to innovate in big ways, facing those curves. This is a young kid at MIT who invented an electric motorcycle. It has two wheels side by side. It's got a gyro in it so it doesn't fall over. And that's not going to solve the world's problems. 9 billion people riding around on electric motorcycles, especially if they're coal energy, it's not going to do it. But we're so underinvested in energy sciences, and just Google for that. I want to skip it because it's so devastatingly frustrating. And literally, Google for declining research and Revkin if you want to find out about it. Reach is where I get excited. That connectivity that we're not using. Remember, we're using this web as an isolation tool. But if you use it different ways, this is an agricultural extension project in India through a nonprofit group called Digital Green. And whoops, oh, you don't see it yet. There we go. It's a YouTube channel where the people go to these villages and get a farmer in the local language, and there's dozens of languages, to say, well, I tried to plant it, I changed the planting this way and planted it a week earlier, and it doubled my production. And because it's the farmer in his local language, other farmers completely resonate with it in a way that if it's a white-suited extension agent, isn't going to happen. And it's, remember, there's 7 billion cell phones on the planet now, and every village has an internet cafe. So it's not like no one has access to these tools. The hashtag is something I'm a fan of. Not everyone should be on Twitter, but the hashtag was an invention. I love that. Chris Messina, you think about an invention being like a solar panel. This guy in 2007 was at Mozilla, the company that made Firefox, and he just said, hey, one day, let's use a pound sign in front of something to create a conversation about something in this whole noisy space we call Twitter. And it's a way to cut through all that Bieber, Kardashian, Trump, whatever noise. You can start to talk about things with people on the other side of the planet who might not be awake when you are, but you create a conversation around. These are just some great examples. Farm Hack is small farmers using technology to sustain tradition. I wrote about it on .earth. It's a wonderful community, and they're not all in one place. Pace Coral was a hashtag for my students when we went to Curacao to do a film about the future of coral reef conservation in the Caribbean, et cetera, et cetera. It's a wonderful way to have a conversation amid all the noise. This is I Am a Scientist Because. It got created randomly by a physics PhD in California somewhere, and it's a way for scientists to tell what they do and why, which is a really great starting place to start to connect with average people. This all requires getting out from what Randy Olson, my friend, calls the nerd loop, which is when we're talking to each other about how to communicate, which is like what we're doing now. Randy is a big fan of just trying stuff. Shoot a lousy video, throw it up there, see what doesn't work, see what does work, start to build a sense of how to do it better. Twitter, here's some scientists who are very engaged on Twitter and help to create meaning amid noise just by being there. They'll say, well, yeah, you heard that about that paper, but it's not really like that, it's like this. And they find a little time in their lives to do that. There are, in a world of shrinking journalism, remember, that's the reality. A lot of universities are getting into that space, not just universities, but agencies as well, creating magazines, creating online content that's competing with the New York Times for attention and for insights onto these important issues. These are just a few examples. And what that same behavioral science that I talked about earlier that was so enervating and like dispiriting leads to a lot of insights about how to make progress. Utah State and Yale did this 50-state survey of what we think about global warming and other things. And you know, this map of global warming views is interesting, not just because it's varied, you know, we're not surprised by that, but it's mostly pastel colors, right? So no one is really like, there are small subsets of people who are very dug in on it, but really most of us are thinking about other things. So global warming as a centerpiece of worry is not something that's engaging America. But percentage of adults who support regulating CO2 as a pollutant. Where's the red and blue America? I thought we were all divided on this stuff, right? I could swear. I mean, look on any, not just Fox, but any news channel, and we're all about division, but it's because, of course, the media are all attracted to argument. We're not attracted to this because it's like, oh, boring. Right? We agree. Percentage of adults who support funding research into renewable, that's not renewable energy sources, everybody's yes. Everybody's like, even way more yes even than that. So that says there's lots to do. There's lots you can do. There's lots of progress to be made. But it's not climate-centric, which is, you know, that's an issue for some of my friends who are all climate-centric. It's about making progress on energy in a way that will divert us from those trajectories. Response diversity, I'm going to fast forward because it's all out there, just search for it. This was a really interesting paper I found from more than 10 years ago on how resilience in an ecosystem seems to be more a function of the diversity of responses of the organisms within it than the diversity of species. So it's the response diversity that creates resilience. So I played with it one day. I said, well, suppose we switch that to being from ecological to social. And this gets to my question. It's an open question. Is diversity in response to the climate challenge our friend, ultimately? Because it's complex, right? So I don't know. Here's one, you know, here we go. You got Bill Gates, who I spent 45 minutes interviewing on video in Seattle, who's all about the energy miracle, and we need them. And you've got Jim Hansen, who's about nuclear. And you've got campaigners, and you've got inventors, and you've got Susan Solomon, who's now at MIT. But she was very reluctant to weigh in as a policy person when she was at the IPCC, unlike some of her peers. So it we need all of that. And we need the same kind of energy initiative Gates is doing in terms of regional or sort of microgrid deployment too. So we need it all. But how do we do that in our politics? And our campaigning is all about, well, if you're not with me, you're against me. I don't know. And I'm just going to fast forward. Oh, I got to show this I have to show, and then maybe I'll jump to the end. In how we teach, this is a class at a high school in the Bronx, public high school, the High School of Energy and Technology, that was created by the city when they realized they were retrofitting a lot of city buildings with more efficient energy systems, but the city didn't have enough people skilled enough to work the new systems. So they created a specialized high school to do that. And one of the things they do there is they go on a field trip to the boiler room. And when I heard about this, I got really excited because my wife, who was a longtime science teacher, she had a teacher once who talked about this because essentially it gets you to look at your school as a system, as not just classrooms and restrooms, but how does it work? How does it work? How much do we spend on oil? How do you heat your school here? How do you cool it? What's the budget? What can be done to reduce that? And there's you don't have to do permission slips. You don't have to have a bus charter. This could happen at any level from elementary right up through postdoc and probably be equally valuable at all those scales. And I've been evangelizing about just this one thing, just have like a field trip to the boiler room. I spend too much time in the boiler room of my house trying to figure out how to make it work better. You know, but it's good, you have to be there. And at Pace University, we've done teaching. I teach this environmental documentary course. On Saturday, I'm taking 16 students with another professor to Cuba and trying to make a film, even though President Obama has completely screwed up our plans by coming the same week. So, and I created a course at the New York Times, where the Times to Survive is trying new business models, where I taught this course. It's like a mini weekend course for high school students. It was called Sustain What? And that's one of my mantras. Don't tell me sustainability. Sustain what? How much nature is enough? How much warming is too much? Tell me, then you can start to have a conversation. And I am going to, there's so much communication innovation out there that's wonderful. And I'll show you just one example. Just changing the wavelength of light. So you're looking at infrared. I'm sure some of you saw this on the nightly news. That volcano of methane in LA would not have been a major story outside of Porter Ranch if it had not been something you can see using infrared photography. And here's a wonderful counterexample that I was at a meeting in Europe. Plymouth University in England did a study showing people infrared images of their own house made them much more apt to change their energy to weatherize than other ways to do that. So, you know, just thinking about the wavelength of light, there's many options, many alternatives going forward. Okay, here's one last one. Look at this. You want to make the case for public transit? And this is one of many animated GIFs on the web, animated images, showing you the same people in different vehicles. And anyone making a case for public transport who isn't using this imagery is missing a great opportunity. And I'm still looking for who made this one. It's been floating around magically, you know. So if anyone knows, let me know. It's in Europe. And I'm going to just cut forward. There's much more to talk about. So I'm going to end at the Vatican. So here I am, a lapsed Reformed Jew, lifelong science writer, and I got invited to go to this meeting at the Vatican in 2014 about the fate of the planet. It's called Sustainable Humanity, Sustainable Nature, Our Responsibility. And that last thing, our responsibility, has really nothing to do with science. That's like the values part. And it was so interesting. This meeting was 4 or 5 days, and you got at least 3 Nobel Prize winners, economics, physics. Oh, this is Paul Crutzen, the guy who came up with the Anthropocene. That's me. That's another one of my wearers. I feel like Zelig, the movie, for those old enough to know Woody Allen. Walter Munk, you'll hear more about him in a second, who was one of the great oceanographers of the 20th century. And the Pope, you know, and like the Pope's posse, and his posse was amazing. This guy named Cardinal Maradiaga opened the meeting by saying, nowadays, mankind seems like a technical giant and an ethical child. And never a more true thing was spoken. It was really, really, really interesting. And it was some of that, again, as I said, it's helped me delineate in my own thinking and work that it's important to figure out that there is that line between your values and your science or your goals as a journalist. Being transparent about it, knowing that there's diversity even among your friends, is a vital way forward. And recognizing the limits of science. Like I'm at the end of this meeting, I was sitting at dinner with Walter Munk, he was 96 then, he's 98 now. And he helped win World War II, among other things. He came up with a wave forecasting model, so those beach landings, you know, could happen with the best chances of success. And I'm sitting there, you know, and I turned to him and I just said at the end of the night, I said, so Walter, what's going to do it? You know, how are we going to get through this century? And he paused, and he could have said like geoengineering or fusion or like mass movement or something. He said, it'll take a miracle of love and unselfishness. I was rocked back to a certain extent, because it was like, I think he's right. But to hear sort of a quant, you know, a numbers person, admit that this takes, there's a value shift that has to happen too, is really, really something. I did a piece, a long piece that's got some of these elements in it. And then Rob Sokolow at Princeton recently came up with the idea. He said we also need destiny studies. One of the biggest issues here is time frames. Because it's easy to have an ethics for our time, like to know that 2 billion people cooking on firewood or dung or whatever, that and we have a responsibility to help them have more options. But it's harder to have an ethical framework for the next 1,000 or so years. And that's where the climate scientists who know this problem best are focused. So this is where I'm going to end. A paper just came out a few weeks ago, Consequences of 21st Century Policy for Multimillennial Climate and Sea Level Change. It's kind of sounds wonky, but it's pretty easy. Essentially here you're looking at the Holocene, 10,000 years or so, end of the last ice age. That's sea level up there. So sea level through all of our time, basically modern history, is that kind of pretty stable line. And then there's now, and this is the state of the ice sheets now. And those are 4 options for our sea level going forward. The high line there is 50 meters above today's. And that's 10,000 years. So we're now poised to make decisions, or indecision, about it doesn't matter so much here, sea level, but it matters if your goods are going down the Mississippi. Between 50 meters or a lot less. But on a time scale, we have no understanding of how to do that. So that's why destiny studies, I think, makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to leave you with the parting word is going to go to Ray Pierre Humbert, who is one of the authors of this paper. I just was with him 2 or 3 days ago, and he said something at the very end of our interview that you'll appreciate, I think.
How confident are you that we connect for the sake of a future planet that's there mostly for our forebears, our successors?
So this is the sort of thing that I have hopes for, but I wouldn't even venture a prediction. This is humanity's final exam, and just like you don't really know how well the students will do on the questions until you get the exams back. I don't think we'll really have the answer for 100 years. I certainly know that there's enough goodness and enough innovative potential in humanity to solve this problem, and the consequences of not doing it right are bigger than I think any other thing that humanity has faced. So I'll just say I have hope, but I won't have a prediction. I know we can do this, but I just have no way of assessing whether we will.
So love and unselfishness, miracles. It's going to take a lot, and it's going to take sustained work, sustained focus. And that's why I'm glad you're all here and that you've been able to sustain your attention. Because even Bill McKibben, that'll be the last slide. I talk about urgency and patience. To me, it adds up to urgency and patience. But think about those 2 words, urgency and patience. They don't seem to work together. But to me, that they result in engagement, and that's what we need. Sustained engagement. That if there's handoffs involved, there's letting go involved. You have to let go of some things to have that level. And this is his least famous book. It was about the year he spent training as a long-distance skier, and it reflects a lot in me about Bill McKibben. He talks about urgency and 2 degrees and do it now. But look at his life. 30 years of doing this. So that's the thing I try to get. That stuff. And there's another reason to stay engaged, which is this. So thank you for your patience. I don't know if we have time left for questions, and it's been great to get to know you. And if there is time, I could sing you a song too, but we'll see.
I would like to take a couple of questions. I think we can do that. Bill?
Okay.
I strongly support what I think you were saying. I'm a scientist. I've been a scientist all my professional career. But back 4 or 5 years ago, I'll just comment that 4 or 5 years ago, in a rush to maintain our university's position in the standard of the academic Association of University Professors, we chose to cut the liberal arts and other disciplines in order to then be able to fund the sciences, which I disagreed with at the time but didn't voice my opinion. And that, since that you're saying that's probably the wrong decision, it certainly flies in the face of what Bill Gates has just said, that we need a miracle of technology in order to be able to address this. But I disagree with that we need better understanding of each other in order to really make the things work. Would you comment on that? Is that correct?
I would just say yes. Although I do think we do need new technologies, and the ones we have don't add up to that deep dive as we still do this. So we need, and he's the one, remember, his investments are for something that will or won't pan out in 2030 or 2040. That's the rare thing. In the interview I did with him, he said, when he thinks about back to Microsoft, he said, in the world of software, if I told you, hey, I've got this great product that'll come out in 2040, people would laugh. But he's understood now, even though he calls himself the impatient optimist, that urgency and impatience, I guess, is what he's trying to do. Because you need that too. Even with, to me, you need it all. You need the deployment of today's technologies. You need to foster those. But if you then relax on that stuff, you just can't get there from here. So kind of, we need it all. And that actually, I did a piece on there's a thing called ourenergypolicy.org, and I did a follow-up piece there with that question: can we have a rhetoric that is inclusive of both needs? Because what happens is the Joe Rahms of the world at Climate Progress and a lot of my green climate campaigner friends hate it when Bill talks about the far future of the next technology, but in reality, we need both. So I don't know, it's an open question. But we do need the social sciences and absolutely the arts and all the other stuff too.
Yeah, so your posit is maybe more raves, less war, ecstasy instead of methadone, but we still have Fukushima. So I don't know. Just a comment.
Well, what's the thing about Fukushima?
Well, when we find the radiation in the ocean off of California,
right,
and
but
they've only started to leak. Well, anyway, it's a long story.
No, to me, the first way to have a constructive room for agreement kind of conversation about nuclear is to demarcate between existing nuclear and next generation nuclear. Those are very different questions. And I have very mixed feelings about the Indian Point power plant 10 miles from my house. I still think we should keep it running as opposed to early shutdown. Based on my sense of things, my wife disagrees. And we'll hash it out. And I don't mean my wife and I will determine the fate of the nuclear power plant, but the country, the community, and Governor Cuomo and NRC will hash it out. So, but the next generation reactors are fundamentally different. Remember, everything that's out there right now is a vestige of the submarine. They're like basically submarine power plants that got moved onto dry land. So, but we could talk more about that. Yeah.
In regards to the previous question, I guess I would ask about thorium, nuclear energy, and how you feel about that. But the question I had actually intended to ask you about was a little bit about full automation and what you think about a working force in a world in which we have a robot working force, and what that means for capitalism, and whether or not a working force or a robot automated working force is a prerequisite for a green world in which we are able to turn some sort of a kind of a post-capitalist system towards environmentalism, or whether that's something.
Wow.
Also,
I'll come back next year.
A social scientist here.
No,
radical social scientist.
But no, I think a lot about that. There are things. It's the things we don't think about while we're thinking about global warming, and/or the other things I think about that could come around the corner and be the consequential thing. Countries that are depopulating, like Japan, everything is automated. They have robots that bathe people in nursing homes in Japan because they don't have Filipino workers like we do, because they don't believe in immigration. Even more than we don't. So So automation's coming. The intelligence, the whole data. We don't know what's going to happen. And I was just at a meeting where this CRISPR technology, the ability to sort of create genes from scratch, is the thing that has a lot of people thinking about this ethical child, technical giant question. I give that 5 years, and that'll be the thing that this room will be filled in talking about. But this gets at my point about an agile, connected, smart, science-literate, science-invested culture. With the ethical component, a big part of it. An OTA would be a good thing again. That got defunded. The Office of Technology Assessment was a good thing. It's gone. So anyway, that's kind of me? I'm pro new nuclear energy. There's several different technologies that I think absolutely should be examined. Whether they come commercial and can go through the safety stuff, that time will tell.
Yeah. Okay, so I teach my students that the evolutionary imperative is to leave descendants, and that we are shaped by that. And it strikes me that it's one of the things that we don't actually talk about much in the consideration of the environment and sustainability. But yet we have examples. So we know that fertility rates go down when women are educated and so forth. What other things do you see that would have that same sort of success?
Well, urbanization. Urbanization is a great form of family planning. That's been talked about a lot. In fact, Robert Mendelsohn at Yale, economist, I interviewed him in 2007 for a big piece on the climate divide, but vulnerability. And he said urbanization, getting people, facilitating the development of cities that are functional, that have sanitation and education, is a vital climate resilience strategy, because if you can pull people off of marginal rain-fed agriculture and into cities, that ultimately is better for Africa. And then you have your agriculture build out. It'll be more like agricultural around here, less a million little farms, but that's, it's part of the transition we've all gone through. So he would say urbanization, and that gives you lower fertility rates for sure, and higher, higher survival rates, and higher education rates, and everything else. And I've seen that all around the world. People are moving into towns and cities. 3/4 of us will live in cities within a couple decades. Isn't that right? Something like that. So,
you had that nice slide about it's the variation in responses, not the variation in species, and for resilience.
Diversity.
Response diversity, yeah, and you sort of shifted that to behavioral or cultural, whatever it was. I mean, the interesting thing there is with genetic kind of evolutionary processes, that behavioral diversity gets to spread because of the kind of processes that he mentioned, whereas with, I mean, what's the optimism there that the behavioral responses or the behavioral response variation that we have, but it's the idea that these innovations could be shared as opposed to just further fracturing. So where's the optimism? I mean, because I could easily see the world going in the other way.
I'm posing it as a question. I'm not optimistic. I do think the diversity is our friend, because suppose we end up at the high end of these curves. If climate sensitivity, if we end up at the high end of climate sensitivity and we don't have new technologies or the capacity to build them quickly, Dan Schrag at Harvard, years ago, he said he gave up on science changing opinions. He's on the President's Council of Science Technology. And he said, what we need to do is be sure we have the capacity when society finally gets it to dive in a big way. And that's, but the diversity has to be there. So you're thinking about biotechnology, you're thinking about solar, or you're thinking about space-based solar, or, so you have the capacity to do that, to move with the science. And or to do the facilitated, like there's a guy in India who I think, in my piece about Bill Gates, I included a chunk on an energy innovator in India who's all about village scale access. He doesn't give a hoot about centralized power, and in a country with 300 million people, no electricity, most of whom are rural, who need electricity right now for their refrigerator and their sewing machine, you need him as much as you need Bill. So that's the diversity I'm talking about. And I don't know, it's an open question, All I know is that being more closed to me and more isolated in our bubbles doesn't feel adaptive to me. But it's an open question.
Well, thanks everyone for coming.
And if you want to stay for 3 more minutes, I'll sing a song.
Yeah,
But you can
and-
leave if you need to leave.
Exactly, but yes, Andy is going to perform for us briefly.
Yeah, that's what keeps me sane, you know. And I was lucky enough to be able to play with Pete Seeger for a long time, 20 years, because he lived nearby. But I wrote this song. This song I wrote about 10 years ago. It's called Liberated Carbon. And it's liberated carbon. Because I've heard that phrase, you know, we were liberating carbon. And but it has other meanings. It's a 3-minute history of humans and energy. It's on YouTube too.
It took 1,000 generations for our species to rise. But gathering and hunting was no way to get by. We yearned to burn more than dung and sticks. But someone came along and said, hey, try like this. He opened up the ground and showed us coal and oil. Said, come liberate some carbon, it'll make your blood boil. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Hey, hey, come on and liberate some carbon, babe, it's the American way. Now I got peat swamp fossils running my TV. BP's Black Label burns in my SUV. We can light up the planet like a Christmas tree. They say that things are getting hot, but hey, we've got AC. Adaptation. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your bills. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Hey, hey, come on and liberate some carbon, babe. It's the American way, and the Chinese way, and the human way. Pump those electrons and that gasoline. No sweat or hurry, just turn on a machine. We send an army to the desert to keep this country free. Hey, hey, and to liberate some carbon, baby, for you and me. Liberated carbon, it'll spin your wheels. Liberated carbon, it'll nuke your meals. Liberated carbon, it'll turn your night to day. Hey, hey, come on and liberate some carbon, baby. Liberate some carbon, baby. Liberate some carbon, baby. It's the human